Hey, hello, and welcome to the Takarazuka Revue fan podcast, a podcast where fans from around the world get together to chat about the review and its shows and stars. Today it's just me, sadly, because summers are always busier than people expect them to be. Well, as a solo show, I thought I'd chat a bit in more detail about the Takarazuka Revue during the early years of the Showa period, particularly the war years of the 1930s and 40s. I'm particularly focused on them right now because I finally got around to spending a sadly exorbitant amount of money to get a copy of the 100th anniversary book on the actresses of the review that came out in 2014, and I've been spending my summer filling in more details on the actresses of the 30s and 40s onto the Takarazuka Wiki. A lot of the anecdotes and information in this episode is due to Makiko Yamanashi's great History of the Takarazuka Revue since 1914. And I'll put details of that book along with other references up on the blog post, along with a lot of period photos. So please check them out at kaithian.net/Takarazuka podcast. That's CAITHION.net/Takarazuka podcast. Also, I don't have any pre-war recordings, but I'll sprinkle some late 1940s and early 1950s Takarazuka songs in here as well to entertain you, and you can find them listed on the blog post. So, to situate, for those of you who may not be early 20th century history buffs, during World War I, Japan allied itself with the UK and joined the war when it was promised some of Germany's territories in Asia. As a rapidly modernizing island nation, Japan needed to compete with other colonial powers for resources such as oil and ore. After the war, in the Roaring Twenties, Japan's entertainment industry owed a lot to Western influences such as revue shows from France, cabaret shows from Weimar, Germany, and musical influences from New York. Many of the earliest Takarazuka playwrights and directors went abroad to do research, just as they continue to do today. Mon Paris, the first Western-style revue show, opened in the Takarazuka Grand Theatre on September 1st, 1927, and even today there is usually some kind of event held every September 1st to commemorate it. In fact, Mon Paris was part of the first set of Takarazuka shows performed at the prestigious Kabuki Theatre in Tokyo in 1928. One of founder Kobayashi Ichizo's driving beliefs was an accessible theater for the people, where prices were low and availability was high. That's why he built the biggest theaters in Japan, or possibly even in Asia at the time, in the 1920s and 30s. So, female actresses, Western-influenced shows, and huge theaters for the masses. An interesting amalgamation of the times. Okay. Back to those colonizing tendencies post-World War I. Japan really wanted China, just like every other colonial power of the time. In 1931, they staged what later became known as the Manchuria Incident, where a Japanese lieutenant set off some dynamite on a railroad track so that they could blame Chinese dissidents. Having this excuse, Japanese troops then invaded Manchuria and set it up as a Japanese colony. Between areas with strong economic and military presences from post-World War acquisitions and this Manchuria occupation, over 20 Takarazuka have listed areas of occupied China as their hometown. The Manchuria incident eventually led to Japan leaving the League of Nations in 1933, and 1936 and 37 saw Japan consolidating ties with Nazi Germany and Italy. Kobayashi Ichizo, who had long wanted a platform to show off Japanese culture around the world, took advantage of these ties when he arranged what has become later known as the First European Tour, but at the time was a cultural exchange between these three allies of Japan, Italy, and Germany. They went by steamship, leaving in early October 1938, on a journey that took them nearly a year altogether, stopping in ports along the way, and then traveling by rail through Italy and Europe to reach Berlin. Although long looking up to an idealized version of the West, the actresses were disappointed by conditions in Europe. In fact, one of the most horrible things that they observed was on November 10th, 1938. now known as Kristallnacht, when they witnessed a synagogue being burnt across the street from the theater that they were rehearsing in.
Oogie oogie party! Yeah! 붕이 리듬 리다고 돌래 수직이냐 리듬이야 붕이 고소대모 미나들 타노시 리듬이야 붕이 아메리카 말레노 스테키나 리듬이야 하부 발음이 거의 파리나 마티니 기토기 요키나 파리코아 거짓말지 오키니리
Meanwhile, in Japan, censorship of public works was increasing, and the government was pushing for more propaganda for the war effort. Actually, one of my favorite Japanese movies depicts the growing censorship of Japanese theaters in 1940, and I highly recommend it. It's the 2004 Warai no Daigaku, University of Laughs, starring Yakusho Koji and Inagaki Goro. It's hilarious, but also a very touching story of human relationships. The Japanese DVD comes with English subtitles, so check it out. Sorry for the sidetrack, but I really love to plug that movie. So, right, censorship and propaganda. I had previously read about how the review sent actresses to perform for troops in Manchuria and around Japan, and I considered it an understandable move for a theatrical company. Jennifer Robertson refers to Kobayashi's serving in the wartime cabinet as the Minister of Commerce and Industry, and states that he, quote, colluded with government censors to produce patriotic musicals, end quote. But Makiko Yamanashi puts another slant on things with an interesting story. Apparently, while traveling back to Japan by steamship from an American tour in 1939, the Takarazuka ladies met a group of Canadian basketball players. The Canadians were headed to play a game in Kansai. They mentioned that they'd seen the Takarazuka performance in America, and they urged the ladies to come see them play in Japan. Well, an Osaka newspaper picked up the story with the headline, "Shocking Disgrace of Takarazuka Girls Who Went Abroad," and the ladies were criticized for going to cheer on the Canadians at their game. The military, who had been planning to send the review to occupied Manchuria, used the scandal to pressure the company to do so as an apology gesture. As a side note, Yamanashi also says Kobayashi was purged from his government position in less than a year for opposing a military plan, and then he published a shortly-to-be-banned article entitled An Account of Military Failure shortly thereafter. So certainly the situation was more complicated than Robertson seems to convey. In any case, as a result of the censorship and propaganda, westernized vocabulary and stories disappeared from Takarazuka productions. Indeed, the famous director Shirai Tetsuzo was ordered to leave the review for 10 years in 1940 because he refused to purge his beloved Western review influences. Titles came to reflect this new, serious bent, including shows like Advance the Naval Flag and Winged Victory. Military uniforms replaced tailcoats on stage, and the military-like gray uniforms that Takarazuka Music School students wear today came from this period, replacing the distinctive green hakama that they had worn previously. Other pressures were brought to bear on the review, including forcing stage name changes if the Chinese characters in the names seemed disrespectful to the imperial family, such as the God character in Kamio Nishiki's name. Robertson also notes that in 1939, Osaka Prefecture banned otokoyaku from performing there. Although, as they performed at least twice in Osaka in 1940, including shows with titles like Aviation Japan, I wonder if this ban was quickly lifted or if exceptions were given for patriotic productions. The war continued. Theaters all over Japan were being forced to close, and Takarazuka was no exception. There are several stories of angry military or police presence, with swords and sabers, shouting at the audiences. The larger Grand Theater in Takarazuka and the Tokyo Takarazuka Theater in Tokyo were closed by government decree in early 1944. during the final production in the Grand Theater on March 4th, thousands of fans flocked to see this last performance. So many people, in fact, that it was standing room only and they weren't able to close the doors. While their main theaters were closed down, the ladies were signed up with government entertainment troupes, and also performed in several smaller theaters that the parent company owned. Although Takarazuka escaped severe bombing, and in fact, US propaganda leaflets were dropped over the city saying things like, "Do not worry, Takarazuka girls, we will not bomb you." There are anecdotes about former star Kadota Ashiko, who had been the first otokoyaku to cut her hair short in 1932. She had retired from the revue in 1938, but then she became a dormitory dean for Takarazuka Music School. According to the story, she would calm the girls down during the air raids, while at the same time keeping an eye out of the windows for danger. Sadly, not all of the Takarazuka ladies escaped the war unscathed. Many actresses are marked as dying while still members, although we do not know why. Possibly illness and malnutrition, if not directly as a result of violence. Former star Sonoi Keiko died from radiation poisoning because she had been performing in Hiroshima on the day of the nuclear bombing in 1945. And Itoi Shirare was killed in a bomb shelter in July of the same year during an air raid in Mie Prefecture, shortly after she had retired from the revue to get married. During 1944 and 1945, the Japanese Navy used the two large Takarazuka theaters as barracks. And even with the end of the war, the situation did not greatly improve. The Grand Theater was claimed by the occupational U.S. forces as a headquarters, and the Tokyo Theater was renamed the Ernie Pyle Theater in honor of a deceased war correspondent, and it was used to entertain the troops. A New York Times article dated February 24th, 1946 notes, quote, "Ernie Pyle Theater opened for use of occupation troops, Tokyo," end quote. In the spring of 1946, the Grand Theater reopened with productions of Carmen and Spring Dance, which received positive reviews in the papers. I put a link up on the blog to some color footage from that performance, which was also the Hatsubutai, or debut, of many girls who had joined the music school during the war years. In 2010, I was lucky enough to go to a presentation of that footage, which was followed by a discussion with 3 women who had debuted in that show: Chiaki Mitsuru, Chio Kaoru, and Fushimi Kazuko. Among other things, they mentioned that they participated in the war effort by making things for the fighter pilots and performing in the touring companies. Sadly, they said that many of their classmates had passed away before being able to participate in the Hatsubutai, and many others weren't able to return to Takarazuka City to participate. The line dance that you can see glimpses of in the video footage is insanely synchronized, and apparently they actually rehearsed the line dance choreography for a year straight. They also performed the line dance throughout 1946 in the reviews. Their muscle memory was so good that the 3 ladies recreated the arm motions for us without having planned it ahead of time. Hatsukaze Jun, a 1970s Takarazuka star, was another guest at the event, and she was very impressed by their being able to recreate their line dance choreography. And when the gentleman talking with them asked her if she remembered hers, she laughed a slightly embarrassed laugh and replied, "Not at all." but then she hadn't rehearsed it for a year and danced it for another year. The first few rows of seats in the newly reopened Grand Theater were reserved for U.S. troops. There are many anecdotes of soldiers seeing the performances and falling in love with the actresses, and James A. Michener used his own experiences as a reference when he wrote the novel Sayonara. The main character of Hanaogi is said to be based on Takarazuka star Sumi Hanayo. Shirai Tetsuzo returned from his 10-year enforced absence and wrote and directed Gubijin in 1951, a lavish Chinese historical which was a huge success. It was the first Takarazuka performance that contained only one show. Previously, performances contained anywhere from 2 to 6 separate shows. Just like today, they tend to be 2 shows, a musical and a review, or one longer 2-act musical. It was also the first show to feature the actresses' faces on the posters. And along with lush sets and costumes, it featured live horses ridden on the stage by the lead actresses. Yamanashi notes that many of these Chinese-based performances of the post-war years were because they still had the Chinese costumes from shows set in China during the war years. The Ernie Pyle Theater reverted back into the Tokyo Takarazuka Theater in 1955 and opened in the spring with a restaging of the now beloved Gubijin. I wanted to end this with a little bit about the boys and men who've joined the Takarazuka Revue, particularly because it's popped up in some of the fan groups lately. Introducing men into the revue has actually happened on more than one occasion. The first was in 1919, still at the dawn of the theater group. 2 classes of 8 young men joined the Takarazuka Music School, although they were disbanded after only 10 months. Still, among this group were several young men who went on to become directors and playwrights, including Takarazuka directors Hori Seiki, Shirai Tetsuzo, and Kishida Tatsuya. They tried again in 1945, after the war. Some have attributed this to low numbers in the revue. However, they had several classes of over 100 students in the early 1940s, and classes of 30 to 50 in the years throughout the war and just after, so I believe it's more likely that Kobayashi Ichizo continued to want to try new things, creatively and commercially. Of the male students from 1945, 46, and 47, 13 joined the revue. However, because of fan opposition, they only ever performed in the larger theaters as a shadow chorus. A final class of 12 entered the school in 1952. However, with the huge success of Gubijin the year before, which showed that high-quality performances were possible with an all-female cast, Kobayashi eventually decided to return the revue to its all-female roots, and the young men were disbanded in 1954. Many were transferred to smaller performing companies of the parent company, or went on to perform for other theaters. Well, I hope you enjoyed this meander back in time. If you have any questions or heard a mistake with something I said, please don't hesitate to let us know by leaving a note on the blog, and we'd also love to hear what you think or if you have anything else to add. Thank you, as always. Many thanks to Michael B. and the Arcanum String Quartet for their wonderful arrangement of Sumire no Hana Sakugoro. And thank you, listeners, for enjoying our podcast.